Critical Based Theory Episode 7. Does Neo-Marxism actually exist? The concept of Neo-Marxism has been a frequent topic of debate over the last few years, courtesy of several public intellectuals weighing in on the foundations of social justice activism. It has proceeded to be tied in with political frameworks such as critical race theory, critical social justice, intersectionality, and most recently of all, race Marxism, all of which are frequently described as having remnants of Marxism, Neo-Marxism, critical theory, and postmodernism combined. I just want to say from the off that these observations are not unfounded. However, I would like to add that many of the interpretations are based on fundamental misunderstandings of what these philosophies ultimately are. My intention in this episode is to unpack the truths and myths about some of the claims made about Neo-Marxism in the hope that understanding what it truly is, if it is anything at all, can pave the way for a clearer insight into why social justice activists are so insistent in aligning themselves with Marxist semiotics. So, the term Neo-Marxism is often traced back to the first generation of the Frankfurt School. The Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, however, actually predates the Frankfurt School itself, who are a consortium of intellectuals at the Institute from the 30s onwards rather than a school in their own right. Many of the leading figures such as Adorno and Marcuse actually joined the Institute sometime after its foundation. The Institute itself was founded 100 years ago in 1922 with orthodox Marxist roots and intentions, but the Soviet Union under Stalin's directorship led to some members becoming disenfranchised and in some cases outright disturbed by the regime. Two of these figures who attempted to take Marxism down a different cause were Adorno and Marcuse, who I have already mentioned. But before them was Antonio Gramsci, who spent most of his intellectual life in an Italian prison. Whilst never actually being a member of the Institute, Gramsci was as concerned as many others about the direction of the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule. However, rather than basing his interest on how to fix the Soviet Union, he set his sights on addressing how communism could be implemented in the West. His observations had a considerable influence on some of the Institute's actual members. Gramsci observed that the revolution as it occurred in Russia was unlikely to happen in the West because of the value Western people attached to civil society, a product of what Marx calls the cultural superstructure. In orthodox Marxist theory, the cultural superstructure refers to the ideology, norms and identities of people of a certain society, which casts a veil over the socio-economic conditions that otherwise cause members of that society to revolt. Civil society was less of an issue for pre-revolutionary Russia, Gramsci observes, because Russia has always been a predominantly collectivist, statist culture upheld by a pre-established aristocracy, which in effect laid out the preconditions for a managerial class to seamlessly take the reins once the revolution had occurred. This makes it little wonder that a similar establishment proceeded to fill the void left over by the Tsar when the aristocracy was toppled. It is a power structure that persists today, even though the communist part of it has since dissolved. In any case, Gramsci's proposal is as follows. If the West's attachment to civil society could be subverted, then perhaps there's a chance that a revolutionary consciousness could emerge amongst the people of Europe. This is essentially where the cultural Marxism conspiracy comes from, and why instances such as the indoctrination of children, the undermining of the family, and the questioning of any objective component to morality have been interpreted by some as part of a Marxist plot to subvert capitalism through the back door. These specific forms of subversion, of course, are not attributable to Gramsci, nor anyone from the Frankfurt School, but the very idea of shifting the praxial emphasis away from economic conditions and towards the oppressive aspects of culture has nonetheless led to the rise of new theories about oppression itself, which has led to these forms of subversion being politically justified in the eyes of some. As we can see from the following quote, Adorno observes that the hostile cultural elements of bourgeois society coerce its members into negating their particular qualities as individuals for the sake of conforming with abstract, or shall we say, performative social standards. I quote, "Culture, as that which goes beyond the system of self-preservation of the species, involves an irrevocably critical impulse towards the status quo and all institutions thereof. This is by no means merely a tendency embodied in many cultural structures, but rather a protest against integration which always violently opposes that which is qualitatively different. In a certain sense, this criticism is directed against the idea of levelling unification itself. Adorno is, of course, talking specifically about the psychological effects of institutionalised bourgeois individualism on those who fall outside of the bourgeois totality, with this idea of a single monolithic totality or hegemony having an ongoing constraining effect on lived experience gives the pretext to what is now frequently cited as Neo-Marxism. Critical race theory and intersectional feminism are both frequently cited as examples of neo-Marxism, and on the face of it, this seems to carry considerable weight because they develop their political frameworks directly from Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony. What's not often said, however, is that the actual theoretical content that makes Marxism what it is totally removed in their application of it, which means that they are actually decoupling themselves from Gramsci's framework entirely. The bourgeoisie, in fact, seems to drop out of the picture altogether. What intersectional feminists do is analyse from the presupposition that all forms of systemic and social oppression transcend from the dominance of the cisgendered, heterosexual white man. In contradiction with both Marxism and the presuppositionless method of critical theory, this is a claim which itself demands presuppositions about biological sex not being a factor and race itself being an actual causal power in a person's behaviour. What the critical race theorists or race Marxists do, on the other hand, is fundamentally the same but more basic, in working from the presupposition that all forms of systemic and social oppression transcend from an ideological commitment to white supremacy. This involves replacing Marx's materialistic determinism with a form of idealistic determinism. This isn't even a synthesis of idealism and materialism as is often claimed. It is an outright commitment to idealism, namely to the idea that the entire West is structured and has been structured in the image of white people assuming themselves to be supreme. Concepts such as white privilege and white fragility are simply Marx's false consciousness reinvented from scratch. To Marx, the false consciousness, or bourgeois consciousness, emerges from one being in a fortunate enough economic position to not see or interact with the class antagonisms that the working class endures. But to the race Marxists, the false consciousness emerges directly from race. Given that race is unchangeable, the race Marxist staple progressive position is to deplatform, censor and remove that race they believe to be the dominant hegemony from positions of power until they have second to no influence at all. This is because the subordination of this hegemony is literally the solution to the race Marxist. To be sure, Marx acknowledges racism to exist as a social problem in capitalist society, but only as an outgrowth of backwards economic conditions. This is the opposite position of Black Lives Matter, who presuppose that white supremacy is a historical antecedent which leaves capitalism to be interpreted as an historical outgrowth of white supremacy. When you look into it, there is no actual Marxist content in Neo-Marxism. It is a complete reversion of Marx's entire philosophy of history. One cannot simply swap out the economic dimension which plays an essential role in the entire theory, replace it with an abstract theory of lived experience and still call it Marxism. Well, okay, you can do that, but then you would be participating in the very thing you're accusing your opposition of, subverting an established definition or meaning to further your own agenda. If this is what a neo-Marxist is, then Gramsci is not one. Like Marx himself, diversity, tolerance and multiculturalism are not ideals he would recognise as the ends of communism, nor would he think they were something that the proletariat should be concerned with. Apart from his slight departure from the economic determinism that Marx relies on, Gramsci is still thinking within the Marxist tradition insofar as his end goal is still to deliver communism. But this cannot be said about the race Marxists or the intersectional feminists, because rather than to deliver communism, their aim is to reconstruct society on the grounds of race and gender respectively, which are completely different metrics of equity. In communism, there is only one race, the human race. Whilst the race Marxists have a commitment to economic equity within their programme, it will never come to fruition on the grounds that its other commitment to segregate people on the grounds of race would prevent it from doing so. What you actually end up with is racialised fascism or apartheid in reverse. Another thing that is commonly assumed is that the frontline political role given to sex, gender and race can be traced back to Marcuse's infamous essay Repressive Tolerance. This is true, but only partially. Marcuse does not go as far as saying that people of colour, those with alternative sexual preferences and gender identities, etc., constitute a revolutionary class in waiting. However, this conclusion can be abstracted from his observation about America in this essay and his book One-Dimensional Man, that white people, mainly middle-class men, white men in fact, have enjoyed the fruits of capitalism too much to be able to mobilise as a revolutionary class. Deductively, this revolutionary purpose falls on those who are not white, predominantly poor, and not straight, because straight people, when observed through a Gramscian lens, constitute the hegemonic majority. It is true, as James Lindsay says here, that Marcuse started something that his students turned into an entirely new monster. Now, it is also claimed that repressive tolerance is the political blueprint of the critical theory tradition itself. Well, this is not only wrong, the polar opposite is true. Repressive tolerance is the authoritarian political framework that Adorno and Marcuse, at an earlier point anyway, actually feared and attributed to capitalist epistemology. What they hoped to achieve through their cultural criticism was the emancipation of the particular into the universal, or rather the emancipation of the individual into a wider, transformative, more inclusive society, not the subordination of these unique qualities into an entirely abstract system of ethics like the one they believed bourgeois society to be based on. Because critical theory is set up to deconstruct ideology rather than to establish an ideology of its own, there is no positive dialectic in critical theory at all, only a negative one. But this negative dialectic, as Adorno articulates in his book of the same name, has only a theoretical, predominantly subjective purpose, and this purpose is simply to keep the reified forces at bay on an internal level. Adorno's Minima Moralia is, if anything, a personal self-help book based on the idea that there can be no right decision in a fundamentally wrong life. No political action is advocated. Adorno only gives advice on the least bad choices one can make in everyday scenarios. In fact, he goes as far as saying that any attempt to practically resist capitalist reification at a practical level, such as resisting liberal democracy on the grounds that it's not socially just as communism, as Marcuse does in Repressive Tolerance, is destined to make everything worse. The implicit suggestion here is that anything that the social justice left touches is not going to go well. One last thing that needs to be clarified before we move on are the actual roots of critical theory itself. Now, some have claimed that the adoption of the specific term critical was done by critical theorists to knowingly hijack what critical actually means, with the view to redefine it in a specifically social justice context. This, I'm afraid, is completely misguided. The critical in critical theory actually comes from the founding father of the Frankfurt School's epistemology, the critical philosophy of Hegel, which Adorno et al. Applied as a method of social criticism called immanent critique. To quote the man himself, I quote, "In common with empiricism, the critical philosophy assumes that experience affords the one sole foundation for cognitions, which however it does not allow to rank as truths but only as knowledge of phenomena." End quote. The form of social criticism that came out of this then was one that assessed cultural phenomena by using the first principle of experience as the starting point of all knowledge. It does not mean judging reality from raw feels, so to speak, because to do this would be to claim to know the conditions of all experience before the first principle of experience itself is even assessed. It rather involves not presupposing things which experience itself does not immediately give credence to, and seeking to understand the world once we understand the concepts that we actually have. Intersectionalism and race Marxism fail this critical test straight away. Consider the queer theory of sexuality, where gender is presupposed to be a matter of pure self-identification, and where sexual orientation is understood to consist in attraction to gender expressions rather than anything related to biological sex. The moral arguments consistently made by those in favour of the legal recognition of self-identification is to say that what they choose to identify as is not the business of anybody else, and so does no harm to anybody else either. But this is clearly not true. If, for example, you've been married to a biological woman for, say, 19 years, and one day she claims, or at least decides to identify as a man, if you continue desiring her as you did before, because to you she still looks nothing like a man, personally recognising her new self-prescribed gender entails recognising yourself as gay. Otherwise, you have not given her or him the social recognition that she/he demands. This is in contradiction with honouring the lived experience of persons. Respecting their lived experience entails completely reconfiguring your own, and this is where the contradiction lies. Self-identification does not just entail one being allowed to be what they claim, it entails reconfiguring the minds of everybody else in order to reconstruct society in their desired image. What critical theory shows then is that intersectionalism does not emerge from an immanent critique of bourgeois society or from an immanent principle, but from the off. It's designed to act only in the interest of those with gender dysphoria who want to reify something that to many is a delusion. This introduction of the concept superstraight, as a matter of fact, qualifies as a legitimate act of revolutionary practice on critical theory's terms because it forced the intersectionists to admit to the absurdities at the heart of their own argument in order to sustain their own moral claims. The critical race theorists, or race Marxists as they are now called, can be observed to be doing this with the implicit idea of race and heritage being a social good for some, but not for others. And for those who have compelled to grow up, compelled to look down on their own history, are on the standards of the critical race theorists themselves on the receiving end of structural ostracism, which exists because certain biases towards certain races are indeed at the heart of the system. What this shows is that their very conceptions of equity and equality, which they present as strives towards anti-racism, are indeed racist on the terms that critical theory itself sets. Thus, there is no critical in critical race theory or Marxism in race Marxism. Neo-Marxism then doesn't really amount to anything other than one desired group affirming its will against another, but without question, being able to align themselves with Marx's image is nonetheless helpful, given that it is an effective way of, collecting people with diverse opinions around a single cause which they only half understand, or perhaps don't understand at all. Whatever we wish to call these philosophies or political movements related to race and gender, they are not critical by definition, and those who support them should be called out for what they are: fundamentalists. Some of the most powerful arguments against wokeness, as I have tried to show in this series, actually come from critical theory. So throwing it under a bus without looking at its credentials just because some social groups lay claim to be working within the tradition causes us to miss the opportunity of exposing the sheer irrationalism of their claims.